So, can you actually use pure logic to argue that there's only one God? Well, that's the exact question at the heart of a classic text, the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Today, we're going to dive into its really fascinating argument, which all comes down to a powerful split between what's objectively real and what's just a creation of our own minds.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. We'll start with the central question that kicks this whole thing off. Then we'll dig into the two main pillars of the argument, the idea of objective truth on one side and creations of the mind on the other. From there, we'll see how the concept of infinity becomes the secret key, and then, and this is where it gets really interesting, we'll see how that very same logic can be completely flipped on its head.
Okay, so let's get right to it. Where does this all begin? It starts with a simple, super direct question from a foundational theological text that really sets the stage for everything that follows.
The question seems straightforward, right? But the answer? That's where things get deep. It immediately draws a line in the sand. On one side, you have what it calls the living and true God. And on the other side, well, you have everything else. And believe me, that one distinction is the engine for this entire argument.
So the text uses this phrase, living and true. But what does that actually mean? To get a grip on this whole argument, we've got to unpack that first. This is basically pillar number one, the idea of an objective, standalone reality.
Now, according to this text, we're not talking about some idea or a philosophy or even a feeling. It's presented as a foundational reality that just exists all on its own, totally independent of whether you or I see it or even think about it.
You know, to really get this, it helps to look at it from another angle. In English, we say objective truth. But check this out. In Mandarin, the term is keguan zhenli. And what's cool is they both point to the exact same thing, an absolute, single, external truth that's totally outside our heads. This idea, it's the absolute bedrock of the whole argument.
And that brings us to the next big piece of the puzzle, infinite being, or in Mandarin, 无限存在. Now pay attention, because this is where the logic really clicks into place. Just think about it for a second. If something is truly infinite, eternal, all-encompassing, how could you possibly have two of them? It's like the definition itself makes it impossible. Tuck that thought away, because it's going to be super important later.
All right, so we've got pillar one down, this single, objective, infinite truth. So what about everything on the other side of that line? What about all the other gods? Well, that brings us right to pillar two, the idea of creations of the mind.
And yeah, the text does not pull any punches here. It basically says that all other deities are in a totally different category. They're not external realities at all. Instead, they're internal, just products of human thought and imagination.
And this is the polar opposite of that first term we talked about. We call it the subjective mind. The Mandarin equivalent is zhuguan xixiang, which perfectly captures that inner world of our thoughts. In the context of this argument, this is where ideas and concepts come from. But, and this is key, it can't create objective reality.
So let's just lay it all out. You can really see the massive wall this logic builds. On one side, you have a single infinite external reality, and on the other, you've got multiple, finite, internal creations of the mind. One is truth with a capital T. The others are just mere creations. The argument leaves absolutely no middle ground.
Okay, let's just pause on that for a second. If we're playing by the rules of this argument, what's the fundamental barrier here? Why is it that a subjective creation can never jump over that wall and become objective truth?
Well, the answer, the key that unlocks this whole thing, takes us right back to that concept we talked about just a minute ago, infinity.
Really, the entire argument comes down to this one simple point. If that objective truth is genuinely infinite, all-encompassing, no limits, then the very definition means there can only be one, right? Because a second infinite being would be a total contradiction in terms. It'd have to exist outside of the first thing that already includes everything.
And that's the checkmate. That's the final move. If a being is truly infinite, limitless, all-encompassing, there's just no room left in the universe, logically speaking, for a second one, or a third, or fourth. Any other being would have to be finite. And so, the text concludes, there can be but one only.
But hold on, because this is where things get really interesting. The source material doesn't just leave it at that. It actually sees a twist coming. It anticipates how this same razor-sharp logic can be turned around to argue the complete opposite.
This is the big what if. What happens when you take that core idea, that hard line between objective truth and subjective creations, and you just tilt it a little. What if you apply that same logic but with a different target?
Well, as the source itself points out, the atheist position, seen this way, doesn't actually fight the premise. In fact, it agrees with the first part. It says, yep, you're right. All those other gods, human inventions. But then it just takes that logic one final step. It takes that last one, the one true God, and puts it in the very same box. It labels it, too, as a creation of the subjective mind.
Okay, wow. So let's just take a breath and quickly recap the powerful and kind of tricky logical structure we just unpacked. So what were the building blocks? First, you've got a question that forces a choice. Second, you build this massive wall between objective reality and subjective creations. And third, you use the concept of infinity to prove there can only be one. But as we saw, that same logic is a double-edged sword. It can be turned right back around.
And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. When you get right down to it, this whole argument, both sides of it, depends on a fundamental choice about what truth even is. Is truth a single external thing that we just discover? Or is it something plural, something internal, that we actually create? Because whichever path you go down, well, that changes absolutely everything.